David Sell, our speaker, is a retired ecologist who specialized in non-native species along with restoration. Native species too, yeah. But he worked in a variety of areas: Point Reyes National Seashore, the National Park Service in DC, and the Nature Conservancy in Washington and Florida, right? And in California. And his last long-term job was with the Modini Mayacamas Preserve up that's run by Audubon Canyon Ranch. So, among other things, and he leads hikes of all kinds, and is also a poet of considerable skill. So, it'd be an interesting story. He spent 20 months exploring Clover Springs, and there's an interesting history there. The city of Cloverdale owns that, but it used to be a very important place for indigenous people collecting food, and still is, I would suspect, although the plants aren't in the degree of numerous things, but it's still, you'll see some plants that are still used today. And here's some interesting stories about Clover Springs.
Good evening. How are you all doing?
Good evening.
This is way up there. There are a couple water tanks in it. You've been there. Just up to the side over here. The preserve starts down at the bottom of the drainage and goes almost to the top of the hill. Anyway, I walked pretty much every trail and lots of spaces in between over the years. And in looking back at all the photos in the last couple of weeks, a number of stories kind of popped into my head, a couple others I'd been working on for a while. But they have to do with where plants live, where they thrive, where they're not thriving, where the trees are growing too tall and shading them out, where trees never were but are now forested. I'll just read this. Clover Springs in southwest Cloverdale, aka the Porterville Creek Preserve, is an old name. It's a beloved place. Folks lived there, took care of lots of plants, named for all the clovers that folks used to harvest. A few of them are absolutely delicious. Any of you ever met bull clover? It's a big yellow flowered thing about that big. Just tastes like candy to me. Just really very, very sweet flavor. But in my walk up there, I only found about 3 clovers, and they're all non-native. Not very many of those. The area's been through a lot of grazing. One of the upper areas that has serpentine looks like it had been sheep ranch, and that really caused a lot of pretty severe erosion. Little redwood grove way up the top of the hill that has almost no typical redwood forest associates. I'm not quite sure why that is. I suspect the grove may have been planted. Anyway, when you pay attention to places through the seasons and years, and you have a focus on what is useful and edible to people and to wildlife, you start noticing when plants are really thriving or not. Are they producing berries or not? Are they generating new seedlings or not? Where are the new seedlings popping up? Are they popping up on the trail? Are they popping up where animals like gophers have been digging up the soil? That tells you something about kind of their story, what they like, where they thrive. And then you look at the burrs, whatever the little stickers on them, or maybe it's an upright little pod with little sticky seeds that when an animal walks by, bumps it, a few of them will sprinkle out on their ankle, and it will be carried on down the trail, commonly gleaned off by the animal's burrow, and maybe that's the sort of spot it likes. Um, the more you pay attention, the more stories you see, and you start seeing the interconnections. This little plant in the background is Yamba, also called wild caraway. I love the flavor of the seeds, love the flavor of the leaves. Native folks used to gather it quite a lot. And when you pay attention to plants that way too, you also like salivate as you walk along the landscape. It's like, I want to taste this. You find there's one little spot where I found a single strawberry, little plant, maybe about 5 square feet. Too much shade, too much mulch. I started carrying ashes from my morning smudging up to give to the little strawberry plant. I cleared a few shrubs away from it to give it a little bit more sunlight. Strawberries are interesting. Commercial ones, you generally these days will treat them with bromide to help sterilize the soil so that they don't have so many nematode and fungal problems. Terrible thing to do to soil, but for commercial strawberries, that's what they do. Fire and smoke and ash tends to do the same thing. Now, as I was thinking about strawberry the other day, I remembered reading the travels of naturalists, an early naturalist named Bertram, who traveled with his father, who was also a naturalist around the southeastern U.S., and they were talking about seeing strawberries everywhere. Strawberries here, strawberries there. You know, what's going on? Apparently, the native folks were burning for those on a regular basis. So putting that together with other things, like an article that I read on food, on smoke, actually it was on smoke, and it was in a magazine on food preservation and such, but the folks got really interested in the effect of smoke on fungi, used for a long time to preserve meat and fish and such. You put them in a smokehouse, and you know. But along with their research, they started just exposing agar plates to smoke, and another agar plate compared to it with no smoke, and the one that had been smoked hardly got any fungal spores started on it. So they started trying this with leaves and discovered that leaves that had been smoked don't get as many fungi germinating on them as one that has been unsmoked. So I started putting these two together and ran into a little plant in North Florida called the Florida gopherwood. Another name for it is nutmeg, Florida nutmeg. We have a relative here in California that is, both of them have very sharp needles that have been used for tattooing. Anyway, this plant had started dying in the 60s in mass, shortly after they'd put a fire lookout tower on the property. And it appears that they also quit burning in the general territory around that same time. And that plant apparently succumbed to 17 or so different fungi. No particular one is a culprit. No clear indication that there was an invasive species, just the fact that it preferred these little drainages that would draw the smoke down when the air cooled, and it would draw smoke from any fire up, just like a chimney when the upper landscape was warming up. So putting these things together, it's like, okay, I think strawberry really needs smoke and ash and fire to really thrive. Go on to another slide and see what. So what do flowers talk about, and what tales do they tell? They tell of leaf and bulb eaters, of pollinators and seed dispersers, of fire, smoke, and ash. They tell of browsers and grazers, of sun and shade, of trails and till. What is that? Often cast within the annual length. Oh, I didn't realize how I'd phrase that. Often cast within the annual lengths and branching of twigs and contrasting shades, sizes, and shapes of trees. Some plants will thrive within that, but you'll also, if you look at the lengths of the twigs that a plant produces in a year, you'll be able to recognize years when they grew really well and years when they didn't. That generally correlates here in California with whether it was a wet winter or not. By the angle of the branching, you can tell one year's growth from the next year's growth from the next year's growth. So if you pay real close attention, you can 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. That's a 10-year-old bush. Let me count another branch to be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, 11. Well, I'm close. 12, 11, 10. Okay, it's about 10 to 12 years old that this plant got started. So this is another way you can start seeing the stories for a few years. You start looking at those bigger trees, and you can gauge by the diameter and how long it grew over the course of 10 years. You can go 10, 20, 30, 40. Try that a couple different ways and end up with a ballpark within 10 years or so maybe of a tree's age. I did this with a bunch of kids down at the Petaluma Mall years ago as part of a little nature walk, and spur of the moment, I showed them how to count some branches and then told them this is a great big oak. If any of you walk by Petaluma Outlet Mall, if you walk along the creek to the far south end, there's a huge oak tree surrounded by trail. Anyway, they did their best at counting it, estimating it, and they got from about 180 to 200 years, 300 years. And I said, okay, so what does that mean? This tree is as old as pretty much history in California or older. Maybe all the way back to Drake, but it puts you in that time frame. So the kids were out there counting, learning how to estimate, and then correlating with history that they'd learned. But we can all do this kind of thing if we pay close attention to the twists and turns and lengths of branches and whether things are thriving or not. So anyway, a lot of fun kind of puzzling out these things. Now, in key players, native folks, grizzly elk, pronghorn, and others were eliminated, reduced, or excluded, everything started shifting. They were no longer playing that role of tilling up the bulbs. And this is really important. When you look into some of the ethnographic literature, an anthropologist named Jan Tenbrooks studied out on the Channel Islands and uncovered some very large pits and ovens for baking Brodia, and did calculations, and they looked at similar places all around the greater LA area and determined that they were eating Brodia bulbs every year by the millions. Hard to imagine enough Brodia to support that year after year. We tend to plant a few little bulbs and are very tender with them, and they often disappear within a few years. I've seen that happen several times at the Arboretum at UC Davis. I'll be hiking along, oh, there's 5 or 6 Brodia, how exciting. A couple of years later, I'll come back and they're gone. Another patch will show up over here. Somebody's planted them, they're tending them for a tiny bit as they get the plant established, and then they leave it alone. And that population disappears. So without grizzly bears and people, things like Brodias dwindle away. People tend to be happy if they see 10 or 12 Brodias on a road cut. A patch of 20 is a really exciting thing to see. But it used to be like this hillside right here is full of yamba, but also here and there are brodias and calochortus and other bulbs that thrive with grizzly bear digging and people digging. And so for a long time, we've taken this view that if we put a fence around a place, if we put a designation saying this is a park, and then restrict direct interaction with plants, take only pictures, leave only footprints, that's not enough for the Brodea. The Brodea miss us. This is something Native folks that Kat Anderson interviewed commented about. So without our attention, they get sad and they go away. They need people. They need grizzly bears. They need gophers and badgers and all these sorts of things. Now, out in this preserve, the main place that I was seeing modest populations of Brodea were on the trampled edges of trails where wild dandelion relatives and some non-native dandelion relatives grow. Gophers love those. And so this area by the trail side, it gets some trampling, but it also grows food that the gophers will dig and churn. And so the Brodeas can make a modest stand there, often right along the trail edge, not out in the general field. So just one of those stories to kind of keep in mind when we protect areas. We maybe need to have a cadre of people trained as substitute grizzly bears, dig up those bulbs, maybe roast them. I mean, that's one of the things I want to see before I get old and die. I want to experience a Brodea roast. I want us to take care of some fields and make it so that there are at least a few thousand Brodeas in a place so that we can all have a spoonful of roasted Brodea. It used to be celebrated all over California, but it won't if we don't have somebody pretending to be grizzly bears or reenacting the way Native folks would tend and dig with nice digging sticks or whatever. So yeah, some of the bulldozed areas are some of the best shooting star patches on the preserve. That trampled scrape ground works great for them. One extra interesting thing about it is this is one of those plants that has seeds with a little edible part on it designed just for ants. So you get that trampled ground, the ants are able to find all kinds of weedy seeds and collect them. And if there are any of the shooting stars around, they'll grab those, especially take them back, chew off that little part, feed their little ones. And the seed gets left outside, sprouts and grows, and the presence of all those ants keep some critters from messing with them, and the ants sometimes will actively protect plants like that. So just some interesting little co-occurrences, but that dozing by the bulldozer basically made some good hard bare soil that the shooting star loves. Another place where the shooting star showed up, and there's a little 5-acre hill separated from the main preserve, surrounded by a subdivision, and they mow it once a year for fire concerns. That little spot has all kinds of shooting stars around the edge that only gets mowed every once in a while, but it's also got lamb's food, little tiny pink plectritis, sometimes called sea blush. The only place on the preserve I saw it is this place that gets mowed every once in a while, comparable to Coulee elk and prong antelope coming through as a big herd every year, chewing things down, and that's enough to keep sea blush. And what are some of the other sweet little things that I found there? more blue-eyed grass in some areas. One of the little leptosiphons. Anybody know what a leptosiphon is? Somebody back here knows leptosiphon. The name means narrow tube, and these little plants are usually not more than about 1 inch or 2 inches tall, and half of that is flower. They have a tube that is so narrow that, and you've got to have an insect with a tongue that long that can thread it down through this very narrow tube to get nectar. But most critters with a tongue that long would bend the tube over and it would close, and so it can't get nectar. Tube closes, you can't get through it, just like kinking a hose, water can't get through. So just a sweet little thing like that little flower. The story it tells is it needs somebody with a long tongue that can hover. If you've ever spent a great deal of time around those, every once in a while you see these little flies that one of my professors used to refer to as a flying teddy bear. They're very, very fuzzy, usually a soft golden brown color. And they hover just as good as a hummingbird. They can fly up and down, forward, backward, and they can go to a skinny little flower like that and get right to the bottom and get their food. But that flower, that fly, needs bare ground, needs lots of wildflowers for nectar, and this one flower is one of the ones that's really specialized on that little fly. Interweaving stories. It gets so complicated, trying to figure out what to do with landscapes. What shall we do with the mix of old and shifting tales of each native plant? What do they ask of us? To fill in for key players, to till the bulbs as grizzly and native folks once did, to coppice and gather twigs for daily cooking fires, and so on. We do a lot more controlled burning in the last few years since those big fires. But it currently is only being done by paid crews or people in training to be a paid burn specialist. And they generally take all those twigs and make a great big pile and then burn that big pile. But back in the day, the native folks were out gathering resprout twigs because they're nice and straight and easy to bundle and carry home. But they would bring home enough for basically 3 meals a day, all year long, collecting twigs and sticks that will make our landscape safe. So we need to all get twig fires, twig stoves, start cooking our tea on twig stoves. Let's see what else I got in here. Some of the flowers. I mentioned the flowers in the mown meadow that need that activity that elk and pronghorn would have done. Currently, it's being done kind of roughly with mowing. Bull thistle. Only found out a few stray spots. I've never seen it be a real problem on a site. It usually just occurs here and there, but it's wonderfully designed for bumblebees. Bumblebees are bigger than our other bees. A colony is typically being run by one female, or early in the season, a female and her younger first hatch. So it's a tiny, tiny set of bees collecting for the next brood, unlike a regular honeybee hive where you've got thousands of bees that go out and they find a flower patch and they tell all the others with their waggle dance what direction the honey source is in, nectar source is in. Something about the rate of the shake tells how far it is, and how vigorous the shake is tells you how good the source is. So the other bees will crowd around the dance and they'll pay attention to how fast and how waggly and the timing and the direction, and then they'll go and find the same kind of flower and they'll clean that up. But honeybees, they have to find a lot of nectar at any one time, and the bull thistle have that big spiny cover that thistles have. The tube is pretty long down to the nectar on that flower, and it's protected from anybody who wants to steal it from the side by all those bracts and spines. So pretty much open to critters who can access from the top, like butterflies and bumblebees that have long tongues. So in the current landscape, bull thistle is actually a really important nectar resource, especially later in the year. You usually find a few bull thistles blooming, or sometimes early in the spring, mid-spring, late spring, when some of the bees are just coming out. And there's a nice compact source with dozens of flowers that nobody's been stealing from them. You know, it's concentrating there because the regular bees can't get it, the flies can't get it. A few butterflies will sip, but the bumblebees can generally depend on a thistle as a good nectar source, and they will fly up like most bees do, and they will scout all around for the next patch of color and will zip off quite a distance for that. So when you find bull thistle, don't immediately rush to pull it out, stop it. See if there are any native thistles anywhere around. If there are, collect some seeds, propagate it. Replace the bull thistle once you've got a native thistle to replace it with, because otherwise you're liable to be depriving bumblebees of really vital nectar sources. I've already talked about bare-tail mariposa. Anybody know what I mean by thems? If you've been paying attention to the brodias, which have been split into diclostemmas and tritillaeas and brodias and maybe a few other things, the family has been taken out of the lily family, and it's now its own group called the Themidaceae, THEM. So bear's tail, yampa, mariposa, and thems for stew. This is one of my own little jokes. And thinking about stories about critters learning stew arts, which is kind of interesting when you start looking into the origins of stewardship. And Stuarts, the family Stuarts from England, their job was to look after the estate. And the modern word steward and stewardship derives from that. Also, some suggestion that the name itself was like, that was a warden for the king's place. They were a warden. Steward, Stuart. So I joke around with stew arts and crafts and Rabbitat stew. Anyway. There's some of the flowers in a mown meadow. Shooting star, 2 of the tarweeds. These are color variants on hayfield tarweed. A little bit of yampa grows down at the bottom too. The only place I saw suncups on the preserve was in the mowed area. This is that little sea blush over here on the far side. California buttercup. And anybody recognize that one in the upper left, upper right. What's that? Remocarpus? What? Nope. It's doveweed or remocarpus, sometimes called turkey mullein. And most people kind of ignore it. It comes up late in the spring on into the summer. Usually you see it growing on the side of the road in the gravel and such. But if the ground is mowed or if it's tilled by bears, it will grow all over the place. I noticed this out on the...
Is it a native?
It is a native, and it's a very good summer pollinator source. Lots of little native bees actually use it in the summer. So there's the bull thistle, typical grassland. This one actually has a little bit of needlegrass in it. And it looks like a little bit of yampa, but most of it is non-native annual grass with no thistles native in it, but a few stray bull thistle on the edges. I think that's really a rather beautiful flower. And it does not tend to displace other, native plants, but it is important for the bumblebees. Does anybody know who pollinates this fairy lantern, sometimes called Diogenes lantern? Has anybody ever seen a bee climbing in or out of that? I don't know how they get inside. The petals tend to be tightly wrapped around each other, but it's got this great big nectar pouch lined with a bunch of fur that kind of forces whoever gets inside to kind of clamber around and go past all the reproductive parts and do a little pollination away. But I wonder who does it. Does the flower open up, or does the little lady bee have to push her way inside? Because if it's actively going after a flower, it's a female. The male bees just hang around and look for girls and sip on nectar kind of casually. But if they're busy working, pushing their way inside a flower, it's a girl. If you notice, there's a little figure behind the flowers there. That's what my daughter calls a love monster. I took him out there one day for a little flower walk and took pictures with the little critter, a whole bunch of flowers. But anyway, the nectar on this thing is this little pouch here, and it's got all these little hairs around and little speckles that confuse critters. Anyway, I would like people to pay attention to this flower and figure out who climbs inside it, because I've never seen one being visited. Go back to the bears tilling for Yampa, Mariposa, and Nems. Calochortus superbus, I believe. This is the Yampa again. And this looks like coronary rhodea coronaria. It actually refers to a little crown-shaped structure in the middle of the flower. It comes out in the worst heat. So I always tend to think of it as the coronary rhodea. Botanical humor. What can I say? Long string of hummingbirds, hearth, strung with columbine, tiger lily, scarlet pink, warrior's plume. There's a little, what is that? Scarlet larkspur on the end. I couldn't find my pictures of scarlet fritillary, but these plants generally occur in stray little patches here and there, usually on a steep bank or a thin patch of soil. And hummingbirds are notorious for loving red flowers, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. There's nowhere to land on the columbine. You got to come in and up like that. to get to those little nectar knobs, which is, some pollinators will see that little crown, and they'll poke all around there and get frustrated. No nectar. And the tube itself is fairly thick, so it's hard for a lot of bees that sometimes bite into thin flowers to bite through and steal nectar, particularly up on the little nectar knob. And what that means is that it's not getting robbed of nectar. So it can accumulate a fair drink for a hummingbird, which makes it so that hummingbirds can take the time to fly a quarter of a mile to the next patch of red, and a third of a mile this way, and a few hundred feet that way. And they're known for having what are called a trapline habitat. Goes from one red patch to the next. This one is one of the tiger lilies. Where do you go for nectar on that? Typically, a pollinator will approach kind of from the front or the side. Nothing there. There's nothing there. And then they come over on this side and they look at all those dark spots, reddish spots surrounded by yellow, and they poke there and there, and frequently get totally distracted and never get around to coming down here and interacting with the style stigma, the female part, and the little male parts. It looks sort of like that tiger lily ate a little elf, 3 little elves. Oh my God, is that why they call them tiger lilies? Doesn't that look that way? Like little slippers? I think that's why they call it tiger lily. This one is Indian pink, or Silene. Scarlet Silene is one of the names. It's got a really thick kind of ballooned calyx below the flower surface, with a long tube, not terribly long, but an inch or so, with this thick calyx, the green sepal parts, at a distance from the corolla tube itself, and then the nectar is down in the bottom of that. And so you've got 2 thick layers that are also really fuzzy and very sticky to discourage any nectar thieves again. And so again, this one's going to accumulate a fair bit of nectar for the hummingbird. So the hummingbird knows if it pays attention to red flowers for the amount of time it puts in, it's getting a pretty good payback. This one is called Warrior's Plume. It used to be called Indian Warriors. It looks like a flower when you're approaching it from above, a typical radiating flower, but most of those are bracts. You find the flowers when hummingbird sees it, comes zipping around, and then starts looking at it closely and says, oh my God, there's a flower. They're little sideways flattened flowers with approach this way, but the nectar is down that way. So they've got to stick their tongue in there, get their snout against the anthers and the stigma, and then drop their tongue down to the bottom in order to get the nectar on that. And again, it's got all these bracts around it so that nectar thieves can't get in from the side. And the larkspur, again, it's upside down kind of flower, can only be approached by hummingbirds and other like hawk moths or what come from below. But hawk moths and bees generally don't see red very well. So that's another reason why a lot of the hummingbird flowers are bright red, because bees can't see them. They're structurally hard for bees to get to the nectar. So I think that's just wonderful that the long string of hummingbirds' hearth, that's a string of little words that I love to play with, but it refers to that long winding territory where the hummingbird is getting all its food, getting its meals. One of the projects I'm currently working on is trying to figure out how to take care of places closer to home. I'd love to spend more time up at Cloverdale, but we've got lots of little local habitats that are just full of non-native plants and such. But some of them are really delicious. And if you pay attention to the structure, the seasons, maybe the taxonomy of it, you will often find 2 or 3 or more natives that are similar structure, often the same genus or something close, that are missing from the same general territory. And so as you pay attention to the invasive plants and their edibility and use, like the mustard, wonderful, the greens, the flowers in salad, but there are a number of native mustards that we can start finding sources for and start bringing back onto properties. Milk thistle makes a wonderful salad. You have to gather the big leaves so you don't get poked too many times cutting the spines off. But it is delicious. I'm told it's really good cooked in butter too. So I'm trying to figure out ways that we can start interacting with these urban and near disturbed areas in order to start learning what we could restore them to and to enjoy them at the same time instead of really hating the non-native plants. Think, what can I learn from it? What can I do? Our ancestors in Europe used milk thistle all the time. It was favored by the royalty in the Middle East. What is that other plant? I think that's toyon. What? Maybe it is. Maybe that is a pyracantha leaf. I've made jam and jelly and shrub drinks with a little vinegar and sweetener with both of them. And they both make really good shrubs. They make really good jams and jellies and chutneys. I especially like myrtleberry, little blue, looks sort of like a little olive, little paired leaves. You often find it around older parts of town. Combines really well with toyon berries and with pyracantha berries. Also with apricot and various other variations that I've tried. But the notion is that if we start approaching our landscapes with this in mind and with the fact that a lot of plants need grizzly bears, a lot of our areas don't have elk and antelope anymore. So some of the low limbs that would tend to be trimmed off by them are no longer being trimmed off, leading to really hazardous fire conditions, stepladder fuels, all that sort of stuff. So when we have areas like this that are non-native, we shouldn't be just leaving them alone or blasting all the non-native plants, because if you do, nothing native is typically going to come back unless you're actively bringing it back. So let's learn from the non-natives and from our ancestral histories and whatnot, how to celebrate the places we live and slowly, incrementally make it better and better for conservation value. Elderberry, European bay leaves, rosemary. I collected these along trails in Davis, but I've seen them lots of places around downtown Santa Rosa. These three all make good teas, good combined. What do you think? Are those tangerines? I think those are tangerines. Maybe they're apricots. I believe they're tangerines. The juice from those combined with rosemary and European bay, a little bit of sweetener, that is one of my favorite teas. And when I was in Davis, I would regularly walk along the trails in the morning, pick a few sprigs of each, few bay leaves, a few rosemary twigs. I would use it to make tea. In a few days, that would be dried out. I would burn it for smudge, scent, and then I would collect those ashes and would carry it out to a plant, often elderberry, but some of the other native plants that were growing there, and would give them a little bit of ash, a little thank you, gratitude sort of thing. And this one's one that lots of folks are frustrated by. It's called three-cornered leek. It can be a bit invasive in moist areas, but it's also really delicious. So dig it up. If you want to get rid of it, dig it up and make onion dip or things like that with it. Anyway, I wish that I was able to use my iPad to just thumb through a bunch of the wildflower photos from that preserve. But unfortunately, technical issues are not allowing us to do that. I could show you some if we crowd up to the front, but I think that's it for the general talk. Now, any questions?
What were the three things you said for the tea? Bay, rosemary, and what was the other one?
I like tangerine juice. Yep. Mandarin juice. Orange juice works nice. Lemon juice is good. But the tangerine or mandarin.
Estimating large tree age.
Right.
What was the technique again for estimating the age of the oak that's several hundred years old? What were you looking at?
Well,
repeat the questions as well.
so how did I work with those kids to estimate the age of that big oak tree at the south end of the Petaluma outlet mall? Well, when you look in botany textbooks, they will often show some diagrams about apical dominance, where the top stem kind of influences the timing and speed of secondary branches. And if you look close, they often show you that this is the most recent year of growth, and down here are the most recent year growth, and each of those has a little piece of 2-year-old wood. 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, 1, 2, 3. It's 3-year-old here. Go down a little farther, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 to get back to that main part. So that part's 4 years old also. So you can use this to get a rough sense of how much length a branch puts on in 10 or 15 or 20 years, depending on the tree you're looking at. From that, you can do a rough estimate of, okay, there's about 15 years, 15, 30, 45. It's a 45-year-old tree. I just recently did this up at Windsor Creek. Folks were working on some broom removal, and I started noticing that the oldest broom was about 40 years old, and most of the trees growing with it were also about 40 years old. There were some younger broom just inside of that in areas where they had cleared some Himalaya blackberry, periwinkle, English ivy, and disturbed the soil a little bit. And there was a secondary crop, but the old ones were starting to die because the trees were much taller than them, even though they were the same age. The trees were growing like that, and the broom is growing like that. So this population that inspired folks to go out there and start removing broom, it was already fading away. Their own activity was doing whatever stimulation, helping to generate new broom. And so, again, you use that sort of technique and you start getting a sense of the history. And when I talked about the age of the bushes and the age of the tree with the pastor that works at the church that is right against the creek, he said, yeah, that's about when previous owners donated that property. A few years later, they built the adjacent subdivision. So I had pinpointed essentially when those trees and broom plants were able to get started, and they've not been faring well since the trees have gotten bigger than that. So what do you do in a situation like that where you have broom and English ivy and periwinkle, and people are starting to panthus and daffodils because they look prettier than those tangles? And yet, if you just pull one of them out, what's going to fill that space you pull a broom out of? English ivy, Himalaya blackberry, pardon? Right. Okay, so what's going to come in that? Exactly. There's almost nothing native there to come in if you pull it out. So if you're going to pull them all out, you might want to only pull as much out as you can plant. Because if you pull them all out, then you'll get a new flush of broom. The others will quickly come back. But if you start filling it with things that you do want, I always tell people to think about not so much about what you don't want, because that's easy. You can see it and you can recognize that it's non-native or whatever pretty easily. But figuring out what you do want, what you really ought to have there to have a good, healthy system, you've got to do a lot of hard thinking, exploring other areas around, see where different plants are thriving and surviving, collecting seeds, going to the nursery, whatever, to get things that you do want there. So these projects that get inspired to attack a broom. Anyway, big diversion from tree branching, but all those stories just kind of blend together. One of the other plants that was up there was arundo. Everybody know arundo? Bamboo looking sort of plant, yeah, which is considered, almost every reference I looked up on the internet said highly invasive. Well, this clump has been there for 40 years, hasn't moved beyond its initial 10 square feet. It's a big stand, little stand of it. But as we started looking at that, I mean, it's not spreading any faster than you could easily keep up with it or trim it in, but you can make fences to protect some of your planting with it. If you're putting in native onions and brodias and you want the dogs to stay off of them, make an arundo fence, make a shade shelter so you can sit out and learn to basket weave with the periwinkle and the the periwinkle and the blackberry, the English ivy. All those can be used in basketry. So there are ways we can interact with that are on some level joyful, hopeful, and forward-looking. And when we combine those different arts and crafts, gourmet cooking, the number one plant used for reeds for musical instruments, arundo. It's grown for it in the old parts of the world. Some people will actually use the tubes themselves to make flutes. The rough equivalent in all kinds of folk cultures of clarinet. With the reed that we're getting ready to rip out, and yet it's not spreading, it's not taking over the area. If we tend it, we can turn it into great music, great shade, protection for some of the native plants that we do want, and celebrate the whole system. Any other questions?
I understand with grazing and probably mowing that timing is everything. Is there a formula for this, or is this not a one size fit all? Does it depend on habitat and understanding what plants inhabit that area? They're thinking of the wildflower trail in the cattle area of the Jenner Headlands and wonder how they know when to change up the grazing there.
Tough question. I think every site potentially needs to be kind of looked at differently depending on what flowers are surviving there, whether they're early spring bloomers or summer bloomers, that whole mix. And possibly the thing to do with the grazing is the shift it around. Heavy in May some years, heavy in June other years. None in July some years, real heavy in other years, and shift it around so that some plants will find what they want some years, and other plants that need different conditions will find their sweet spot in other years, and constantly kind of shifting it around as native herds would do. Wander this side of the valley one year, that side the next, depending on when they're coming through. So that's really what I would kind of recommend, is some rotating kind of timing, but pay attention to what you've got. If there's something really sensitive or precious, you might pull things around that species, pay extra attention to that. But it's always kind of a grab bag as to what particular timing will do to what plant.
Like about surrogates for grizzly bears and elk.
Pardon?
Thinking like about surrogates for the effects of grizzly bears
Right.
and elk. Have you any thoughts about surrogates for mastodons and sloths and something that was around 10,000 years ago that are just evolved with that?
It's a fun question.
It's stable from.
Virginia and I joke every once in a while when we go driving out in the Laguna, and you'll see a tight browse line where the cows are. Sometimes in the ditch, you'll see branches that dip all the way down to the ditch. And then over the road, looks like mastodons have been working there. The delivery trucks, whatever, clipping off the branches just like the man was used to do. So that's a good question. I haven't thought about bringing mastodon analogs back, but in some cases that might not be a bad idea. One of the places that Virginia and I have been talking about and working on is it's called the Neighborhood down in Roseland. And one of the problems it has is lots of stuff is growing real low and shaggy, and the blackberries are climbing up this way, and it makes a very appealing place for folks to camp. And I can't begrudge people trying to find some place to camp, but that sort of wild living in urban space makes for kind of a serious health hazard. So I'd much rather see folks properly housed, but also pruning some of those branches up so that there aren't quite so many places to hide. Because back in the day, folks would have been clipping a bunch of those down, pulling some of those branches down for firewood, collecting the resprouts on other places for firewood. Lower plants they would cut, and instead of that just growing all rangy, they would come in and clip a bunch of that for basket making. Other tool making. So that's a fun question. Thanks. Any other questions or observations? Yeah.
Where is Clover Springs?
Clover Springs.
Exactly.
If you're driving the main route, parallel to 101, I think it's called Cloverdale Boulevard.
But I know it.
Pay attention, and there's a subdivision called Clover Springs.
Oh.
And tucked back on the west side of that, you'll find a little, I can't remember the road, but you can't get too far lost. You'll find a little trailhead and parking and a gate. And all that.
Does it say it?
Yeah, it says Porterville Creek
Porterville?
Preserve. They call it Porterville Creek Preserve. When I first started going up there, folks were calling it Clover Springs. And I prefer the name Clover Springs. Who the heck was Porter? He had a field. The native folks took care of clovers. They took care of springs. They took care of the watershed. You know, let's honor that instead of some stray person that happened to have a ranch there once upon a time. Let's learn how to take care of the land and respect those older names.
So we see every group now it gives wildflower seeds. No, it's libraries has wildflower seeds. Everywhere is a wildflower seeds, but it's no one really talks about what is the best time, how we can encourage in our garden. So do you have any tips for us for if we have a wildflowers now in our drawer? Most of the time in the drawer we found, what should we do now as the rains is raining?
I think mid-winter, late fall, midwinter, maybe a little bit later. Sprinkle them out. Probably best to scrape the soil up some. And one of the things that I really recommend if you're growing, especially the annual wildflowers, is to pretend like you're the grizzly bear again or something akin to that. Don't just let it grow and go to seed and expect it to come back year after year, because a lot of them don't do well unless that soil's been churned up. I mean, they evolved with grizzly bears for millions of years. Grizzly bears and bulbs working together. And when they're digging up the bulbs, they dig up the whole ground, and all the wildflowers say, "Yahoo, the bears have been here." And they come up gangbusters following that kind of thing. And when you look into the historic literature, I ran into this guy at a conference years ago. He was a rancher down in San Luis Obispo. And I started talking about grizzly bears and stuff. And he said, "Yeah, I've been noticing the same thing on my ranch. When the pigs get in there and till a place up, they come back year after year. And those are my best wildflower spots where the pigs have been digging."
Like using a rototiller, huh?
Kind of like using a rototiller. So I told him about grizzly bears doing the same thing. And the next time I met him a year or so later, he had made a trip up to Mount McKinley, Denali, they call it these days, just to see what grizzly bears did. And he saw me and he said, "Dave, the grizzly bears are digging up just like the pigs." You know, he was so excited. It was wonderful. So that's what I recommend for a lot of those things is pretend you're a grizzly bear. Stir the soil up when you seed them. And every year, don't be too tidy and careful with them, but also respect that the stems, good to leave the stems in place, because a lot of them will be used by the native bees. A lot of native bees will drill a little hole in there, and then they will lay an egg, make a little barrier, lay another egg, and each egg is laid on a little ball of pollen and nectar. So the little lady bee is going to have to go out there and collect all this stuff. And then she makes one chamber, goes and collects, makes another chamber, lays an egg on that little ball, does this again and again. And so those old flower stalks can be really important. And you don't have to just leave them where they are. If you need a tidy garden, consider bundling some of those up and making a little bit of a wild weed arrangement or something like that, a nice tidy bundle somewhere in the edge of your garden, and the bees can still do their thing in that if you need to tidy up. But be willing to accept maybe a few old flower stalks.